Good afternoon. I'm Carmen Twilley-Ambar, president of Oberlin College and Conservatory. I'm really pleased that you're here for the presidential lecture. Before I introduce Stephen, I just wanted to do a few housekeeping things just to make sure that we're all on the same page. At the end of the lecture, you'll be able to come and ask questions. I don't know whether it's going to be a mic passed around, but I just want you to know that we'll have a moment for questions. Get your mind thinking, right? That's an invitation for you to be thoughtful and thinking through the lecture so that you can ask all the right questions. I'm pleased to formally introduce Stephen Checkoway, Associate Professor of Computer Science. His research focuses on security of computer systems with an emphasis on the security of embedded and cyber-physical systems. Now, let me give you a little bit of his background. He joined the Oberlin faculty in 2019 as an assistant professor of computer science. Prior to his tenure track appointment, he held a one-year position here at Oberlin as a research specialist. He earned his PhD in computer science from the University of California, San Diego in 2012. And in primary, his teaching and scholarship interests are in the areas of computer security, vulnerabilities within network systems, and computer chips embedded in automobiles and aircrafts. He received tenure in 2022. I remember reading your file, and very impressive file, and just in keeping with the wonderful faculty here who are at Oberlin. For his distinguished research in 2021, Professor Checkoway was awarded the Golden Goose Award from the American Association of the Advancement of Sciences. And one of the things I think I know about this particular award is really about the sort of relevance of his research to the work of today. And so I hope he'll talk a little bit about that. I'm sure he will. He was among a team of researchers whose federally funded research dove deep into cybersecurity issues with internet connections to automobiles. So I'm imagining, Stephen, someone sort of away from your car through the internet, starting your car, right? And who knows what happens after that. So we're glad you're on the case, Stephen, because none of us wants that to happen. His work has continued to have significant impact in the automobile industry, and many manufacturers were prompted to start to consider safety in a different way on their new cars because of his research. So we're really excited that he is having such an impact on this particular area. The Computer Science Division is an exceptional example of what makes Oberlin special, this department that he's a part of. Their approach to engaged learning is one of the things that has been an important part of the academic experience here at Oberlin. The research, internships, experiential learning, study away opportunities, and that department has a little fun along the way, and that's a part of what happens here at Oberlin. I know that Stephen will entertain you, but mainly help you think deeply about this important issue. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Checkoway, Assistant Professor of Computer Science.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, President Ambar. And thank you all for coming to my talk today. I'm excited to see so many people there, so many people here, especially you, Bob. It's great to see you again. I hope you're doing well. So, today we're going to be, today we're going to be talking about how to think like an adversary in order to defend computer systems. So, President Ambar did an excellent introduction, so maybe I won't say too much more here, but my research is in computer security with an emphasis on embedded system security, which means that I do like to take a look at computers that exist in devices that we don't normally think of as computers and try to understand their security properties. So fundamentally, computer security is the study of how computer systems behave in the presence of an adversary. And the presence of the adversary is key here. Engineers build systems to try to solve tasks, and the adversary is trying to prevent those systems from performing those tasks. And so in fact, broadly speaking, with any computer system, we have three groups of people. We have the designers or the engineers who build the system, and they have some intended behavior that they want these systems to have. We have the users who don't really care about that. They just want to get their work done using the computer, and as long as they can do that, they're happy. And finally, we have the adversaries, or attackers. I'll use these two terms interchangeably. And these are just people who are trying to subvert the system in some way, either make it misbehave or make it do something totally different from what it was intended to do. So this brings us to adversarial thinking here. Now, the way I like to think about adversarial thinking, which is the act of putting ourselves in the mindset of the attacker, is that there are three basic prongs of how one thinks adversarially about a system. First, we want to find the weakest link. And so this is probably pretty obvious. If you have 5 different ways of compromising some system, why would you go for the difficult one? You wouldn't, of course. You would go for the easiest one. And so when we are thinking adversarially about systems, we need to, we want to focus on the easiest things that we can actually attack. The second prong is we want to identify any assumptions that the designers of the system may have made on which the security of the system actually relies. And we have to figure out, is this assumption actually valid? Because it turns out, in many cases, it's not valid. People make these assumptions about how their systems actually behave that are, in fact, not correct. And finally, we need to think outside the box. And so what I mean here is that when you're designing a computer system, it's really easy to get trapped into this mindset of, I'm going to build this system, and I know that when computer A talks to computer B, it's going to send this message, and when computer B responds, it'll send this message. And that's great, but it turns out that the adversaries don't need to follow that design. They can choose to send messages out of order or send messages that are totally unexpected. Okay, so I want to give you a couple of examples of this in, I was going to say the real world, but in the physical world outside of computers, and then we'll turn to some examples, including some from my research, where adversarial thinking helps us defend computer systems. So here, we've got a gate that is secured by a chain and a lock, and I am a novice lock picker, but I could probably pick that lock if you give me, enough time. But why would I do that, right? Obviously, this chain, is missing a link, and it has been replaced with a plastic zip tie. If I wanted to get through this gate, I would use a pair of scissors and snip it, right? Very straightforward. So I apologize for the quality of this picture here. It was a little zoomed out. I had to zoom in. So in the middle of this picture, we have a service road, and there is an access control gate in the middle of it here. And clearly, the designers of this system thought that the cars are going to have to stay on the road, and thus the access control gate is going to work perfectly. But as we can see from the tire tracks and the frost, that is definitely not the case. Okay, and the final one, the final prong was thinking outside the box. So this is an old lever-style voting machine. I suspect that any of the students in the room have never seen such a thing. And in fact, I have never actually voted on a lever-style voting machine. But the way these work is the voter makes their choices on the face by selecting some switches, and then once they're happy with their selections, they grab this red handle here, pull it to the side, and that casts their vote. And the way that that works is inside the voting machine is a complex mechanical system of gears and counters, and when you pull the lever, the counters for the chosen candidates will increment. And these particular style of machines have a really interesting failure mode, which is that vote totals of 99 appear significantly more frequently than vote totals of 98 or 100. And the reason for that is turning that, when the 100th voter casts their vote, the gears inside have to turn one additional counter. And that requires a tiny little bit of extra force, and sometimes the machine just jams. And so this leads to a really ingenious attack that I really love. I was delighted when I heard this. What people could do is you could take a little piece of graphite and you could insert it in the gears for the candidates that you disfavor. And then, when a voter votes for that candidate, they'll pull the lever, the gears won't be able to turn, the counter won't increment, and the vote won't count. But over the course of the day, the graphite wears down and will eventually just fall out of the machine, leaving essentially no trace that anything has gone wrong here. So this is definitely out of the box thinking. And in fact, if we look at all of these, we'll see that there was a failure to think like an adversary on the part of the designers here. So the commonality with all of these is that they simply didn't consider that their systems could be used in a way other than what they intended. Okay, so I'm a computer scientist. Let's talk about computers. And let's start with something that I think we're all familiar with, passwords, and in particular, authentication. So let's say you want to log into a website, either your bank or you're wanting to log into Oberlin, say you want to check your grades on Blackboard or something. We all know how this works. We enter our username and password, and then we log in. So far, so good? Well, what happens after you do this is kind of interesting. First, your username and password get sent over the internet to a server in a rack somewhere, like one of these down here. And then that server is going to take your username and password, and it's going to look it up inside its password database. And it's just going to check, okay, I entered Steve. Does the password I enter here match the password that's stored in the database? If so, I am authenticated and I am given access to Blackboard. So now we have to think, how are these passwords actually stored in the database? And one really easy way to do it is to store the passwords unmodified in the database. We call this storing them in the clear. This is extremely simple, and it's also very dangerous. And the problem here, the danger, lies in the fact that if your system gets compromised, if a hacker manages to break into the system and steal that database of passwords, then they have access to all of the user data for all of those users. So this is a bad plan here. And unfortunately, it's fairly common, although fortunately getting less so. Okay, so let's think about passwords here from the point of view of an adversary. So we have a couple of key facts that we need to keep in mind. One, important websites like your bank and Blackboard use username and password. Unimportant websites also use username and passwords. If you have ever wanted to comment on a New York Times story, for example, you log in and you enter your username and password, and then you can leave your comments. And third, humans have an unfortunate tendency to reuse passwords across different websites. Okay, show of hands, how many people have ever reused a password on multiple websites? I'm going to say that's approximately everybody. So, yeah, of course, like, what else are you going to do? You can't possibly remember every possible password. Okay, so let's put on our attacker caps here, and let's think, how could we use these three facts in order to compromise, say, a bank or Blackboard? And, well, the answer is actually pretty straightforward here. We just compromise the servers for the unimportant websites. We steal their password database, which, if they have stored the passwords in the clear, means that now we have access to all the usernames and passwords, and we can just try out these username and passwords at the important websites. And in fact, it's not just one website we could try it out at. We could try their usernames and passwords at hundreds of websites and see what all can we get access to. So this attack is called credential stuffing, and it's actually extremely common today. There are security breaches all the time where passwords get stolen and get attempted by, let me try this again. The passwords get stolen and the attackers use those username and passwords at other websites to try to compromise them. Extremely common. Okay, so we've thought like an attacker for a little bit. Let's try to actually defend this. And so let's think like a defender. What is it that we could do here? Well, the most obvious thing to do is simply stop storing passwords in the clear. And that's great. We have a solution for this. we use a mathematical function called a hash function, and we apply that to the password, and we store the output of this function in our database. So you can think of it as just taking all of the letters from your password, scrambling them all up, and giving you a long number as the output. And that's what we're going to store in the database. When it comes time to log into a website, the user's behavior is exactly the same. They enter their username and password. And the server is just going to compute that same function of the provided password and check, does it appear in the database? And if it does, then the password must have been correct with extremely high probability. So then the user is logged in. And the key feature of this approach is that if the password database is stolen, well, then the adversary doesn't have your password. They've got these numbers. And it turns out that those numbers are essentially useless to the attacker. It is an extremely difficult, and when I say difficult, I mean computationally difficult task to go from the numbers back to the passwords. We basically can't do it, as long as this is done well. Depends on the hash function. Okay, but you might be thinking, but Steve, we didn't actually solve the problem though, did we? Right, so let's say our bank has implemented good security practices and is not storing passwords in the clear, but let's say our video game forum is not doing that. Well, now the attack just goes exactly as before. We compromise the low security server, steal the passwords, and we can just try them at the high security site. So, thinking like a defender again, you might think, well, I know, I'll just force my users to change their passwords all the time. If I force them to change their passwords, there's no way that they're going to have the same password used in multiple locations. And maybe that's true, but this is actually a terrible, terrible idea. We've known for many years that this is a really bad idea. So quoting from Microsoft here, password expiration requirements do more harm than good. So we should absolutely not do this. However, by thinking adversarially about this problem, we were able to figure out what the underlying cause was, which is password reuse. So, as users, we can actually now defend ourselves against this style of attacks, and the solution is simple. We just use a unique password on every website. Well, okay, that's going to be extremely painful. We don't want to do that. No one could possibly remember that many passwords. Fortunately, your operating system and your browser, and in addition, there are third-party tools, have password managers that can generate passwords for you. It can make them all unique, and you never have to remember these long, terrible passwords. You just need to remember one password and hopefully some sort of other authentication mechanism, such as biometrics, like your fingerprint or your face, if you have Face ID on your phone, for example, in order to access your password manager. And then, as a side effect of using a password manager, you can make your passwords extremely strong, right? I'm never going to remember this. No computer program is ever going to guess this as a password for trying to crack my passwords. So, I don't want you to think that this talk is all doom and gloom. We've got some good news here. As users, we can defend ourselves. Okay. Well, now let's turn to something that's maybe a little less familiar to everybody: computers in general aviation. And when I say general aviation here, the picture you should have in your mind is small private planes like this one that the chair of the computer science department is standing in front of and kindly let me use, and not commercial air transport. I am currently doing research on commercial air transport. I don't have anything to announce at this point. So computers in general aviation only here. So as a little bit of background, the technology in aviation has improved dramatically over the past several decades. So on the left here, you can see a traditional cockpit. It's filled with a bunch of gauges and analog controls. And on the right, we have something called a glass cockpit, where all of these traditional instruments have been replaced with large digital displays and controls that can be used to control the aircraft. So these are great. They're really nice, but they come with one significant drawback, which is that if you want to get one of these installed in your plane, you're looking at a significant expense. So this means that it's basically out of reach for almost everybody. Fortunately, there is a solution. And that solution is to use something like a tablet inside the airplane. And so here you can see we've got a tablet. It's got some maps on it. And the idea is that we can have a tablet, and it gets paired with a receiver, which I'll talk about in just a moment, that's going to receive a bunch of information and can display real-time information on the tablet while you're flying. In essence, you get much of the benefit of a glass cockpit at a fraction of the price. I'm not trying to sell you one of these, I promise. Okay, so here is one such system. On the left, we've got the receiver. It's about the size of a cell phone, or a large cell phone. And on the right, we have a tablet that it pairs with. And the way that this works, if I switch to a diagram form here, is it works in sort of two phases. First, we have some work that happens before taking off. Here we have an application running on the tablet that is going to contact a data provider and download all of the static data. Think things like charts and procedures and all of the stuff you need to have in the plane in order to fly the plane. Then, during flight, we have the receiver in the cockpit or somewhere in the plane communicating wirelessly with the application running on the tablet. And that receiver is going to receive a bunch of different information. It receives a GPS signal, and so it can compute the position of the aircraft. It receives information from other aircraft that are reporting their positions, which happens periodically. They send out a pulse saying, here is where I am and here is who I am. And they can receive weather and traffic information from ground stations. And all of this data gets received by the receiver, and it gets sent to the application running on the tablet. Okay, so with that background in mind, let's think like an adversary again here. There we go. So the parts of this diagram that I have circled in red are the parts that are potentially under the control of an attacker. So there has been a lot of prior work looking at the security of GPS, so spoofing GPS or spoofing ADSB, which is this protocol that we use for reporting position and so forth. I'm not going to be considering that at all. I just want to look at the pieces in red here. So from an attacker's point of view, these sorts of mobile cockpit information systems, this combination of receiver and tablet, are purely information systems. All they do is display information to the pilot. And the reason that this is so interesting to me is that normally when someone tries to take over a computer, the thing that they're trying to do is to subvert it. They want it to perform some action that the attacker wants and not what the user wants. But in this case, the computers have no control over flight surfaces. They simply cannot make the plane do anything. And so any attack is going to rely on the pilot receiving the information that is incorrect and then acting on it against their interests. And to make things even harder, the plane always has the traditional instruments in it. So even if I compromise everything computerized in the MCIS, there is still the traditional instruments that the pilot can use and fly the plane successfully. So I'm going to talk about 3 different scenarios here. And for each of these scenarios, we're going to consider what malicious information is being displayed to the pilot. We're going to consider how dangerous would acting on that information be. And then finally, a crucial piece, how likely is it that such an attack would actually succeed? So let's start with the first scenario here, position. So in this case, the MCIS has been compromised in some way, and it is going to report incorrect position of the aircraft that is of itself, right? It's reporting its own position incorrectly. So how dangerous is this? Well, it depends. So if this information was presented to the pilot, the consequences could range from extremely minimal, like you think you're somewhere or you're not, and you have to fly a little bit farther to get to where you want to go, to catastrophic, potentially a mid-air collision or controlled flight into terrain, which would lead to loss of aircraft and almost certainly loss of life. So this is potentially extremely bad if this happens. But how likely is it to happen? And the answer is that when you're flying under instrument flight rules in controlled airspace, it's extremely unlikely that such an attack would succeed. And the reason for that is that air traffic control monitors traffic through the airspace, through the controlled airspace. And if a pilot deviates from their pre-filed flight plan, air traffic control will contact them and say, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be doing this. And that's actually apparently quite bad. On the other hand, so for instrument flight rules and controlled airspace, this is extremely unlikely to happen. However, in general aviation, we're usually not flying under instrument flight rules. We're going to be flying under visual flight rules. And in that case, whether or not this attack would succeed really depends on a number of things, like what the weather conditions are outside. Right? So if you're flying and you can't see very well and you don't know exactly where you are, that could be extremely dangerous. But if you've got clear blue skies and you're cruising along, you're probably okay, even if you're presented with incorrect information. So how about weather? Weather is one of the things that the MCIS tells the pilot. And so we could consider what happens if some incorrect weather is reported at, say, the pilot's destination. And here, this is potentially catastrophic. So flight into weather that pilots aren't trained to deal with is actually a pretty common problem in general aviation. Some of you may remember the JFK Jr. crash, which was exactly this. He flew into weather that he was not trained to fly into. So whether or not this is going to succeed, whether or not this attack is going to succeed, really depends on the pilot's experience and also on existing weather conditions. And the last scenario that I want to talk about here comes straight out of the classic 90s action movie Die Hard 2. This is not the good one in the tower in LA, this is the one in the airport. So in this movie, the bad guys take control of an airport, and the main bad says to his henchmen that he wants them to recalibrate sea level minus 200 feet. Sure, why not? So it turns out that you could do something fairly similar. You could modify the altimeter settings that the pilots have to enter into their altimeter, which is going to change the reported altitude of their plane. And so this is potentially a catastrophic thing that could happen. You could imagine you trying to land, and you cannot see very well, and you're not at the height you thought you were at. It could be very bad. So fortunately, the likelihood of this actually happening is extremely remote, because although the altimeter settings are published and pilots should have them ahead of time, the air traffic controller often repeats the altimeter settings when the plane is cleared to land. So if you've ever listened to air traffic control, which I encourage you to do, it's kind of interesting, you will hear, if you're listening to the approach, you'll hear them say that they are cleared to land and altimeter setting is blah, blah, blah. So this particular attack is unlikely to work. Now, after thinking about these sorts of attacks and several others, my collaborators and I decided that what we wanted to do was empirically evaluate the security of these MCIS systems. And so what we did is we bought the 3 most commonly used systems, at least at the time we performed this study. So these are the Stratus 2 receiver, which gets paired with the 4Flight application running on the tablet, the Garmin GDL39, which gets paired with the Garmin Pilot application, and the Sage Tech Clarity, which is paired with the WingX Pro software. Okay, so it's not enough to simply think about situations in which something bad might occur, at least not as someone who's trying to secure such situations. We have to actually evaluate, could we perform the attacks in question? And so the way that we do that is we produce proofs of concept that we can, proofs of concept attacks that we can perform in a controlled environment. And so I'm going to talk about 3 very briefly, and I'm going to look at an attack on the communication channel between the application on the tablet and the data provider. I'm going to look at the communication between the receiver and the tablet, and we're going to look at the receiver itself. So let's start with the application to data provider channel. Here, what we discovered was that aeronautical charts and other static data were downloaded from the data provider completely insecurely. So if you remember, URLs used to be http://. At some point, they switched to https://. That's exactly what is happening here. They were using the insecure HTTP version. And so with a minimal amount of effort, we could actually modify all of the data that was returned to the application from the data provider. So we could provide incorrect charts and procedures and basically anything that's static data loaded onto the tablet ahead of time. Now, this only worked for 2 of the systems we looked at, the Garmin Pilot and WingX Pro. The other one, ForeFlight, did the right thing. So this illustrates why we have to look at multiple things to try to understand the security implications of specific instances of the technology that we're looking at, and not look at one and generalize too broadly. Although, if you'll wait a bit, I'm going to generalize pretty broadly from the next topic. Okay, the receiver to app channel here. So the receiver talking to the application on the tablet. So this is a wireless communication that happens. And all of the real-time data that the application sees comes from the receiver. And so if we could compromise this, then we could compromise all of this information, such as the stuff that I was talking about in the scenarios earlier. And it turned out that all 3 of the systems that we looked at were vulnerable to this, although the details of how they were vulnerable and the steps we had to take in order to actually attack these systems varied quite a bit. So here's an example of this attack in progress. So, of course, we actually implement this stuff. We don't just think about it. And on the left, I've got a screenshot of the tablet, and I've zoomed in on this region here, and you might notice that all of the air traffic is being reported as being Air Force One here. So we thought this would be a pretty good demonstration. Obviously, if we can make each plane identify as Air Force One, we could change anything about this information that we wanted. Put traffic at different places. We could say that there are planes where there are no planes. We could say that there are no planes where there are planes. Okay, the last one that I want to talk about is the firmware that runs on the receiver itself. So the receiver is just a computer. It's an embedded computer. It has a processor. It runs software that we call firmware. And like many software systems, it can be updated to the latest version, so you can get new features and bug fixes and so on. And for 2 of the systems that we looked at, we were able to abuse this update feature in order to install our own software to run on the receiver. And we could do all of the things we did before, so we could do this attack, we could do all of the stuff in the scenarios, but we thought that we would try to do something slightly different once we had this capability. And so what we did was and I should pause here and point out, and when I say we did something, I of course mean my wonderful student collaborators did almost all of the hard work. I'm just taking credit for their work. So what they did was we developed some firmware that we call the attractor firmware. And the way it works is there's some pre-specified point in space that we call the attractor point. And whenever the the target plane that has this receiver with the compromised firmware, if it gets within 20 miles of the attractor point, the modified firmware kicks in and it starts subtly and continuously perturbing the reported GPS coordinates. So you can imagine a pilot is trying to fly, straight across this space. It just happens to intersect this portion of airspace. And once it gets within 20 miles of the attractor, its GPS stops working quite right. And if the pilot is following their instruments, they'll see that their position is deviating slightly from where they expect, and so they'll correct. And they will eventually deviate towards the attractor point. Okay, so I've got some more good news. This talk is full of good news. The adversarial thinking, in this case, actually enabled us to find these problems and several others. I encourage you to see the paper if you were interested in this at all. Unfortunately, the likelihood of attacks in this space is extremely low, in my view. And the reason for that is that there's not really a financial motive to compromise computers in these MCIS systems. And so if there's not a financial motive to attack computers, people tend not to do so. And all of the vulnerabilities that we found could just be fixed with standard techniques. We didn't even have to invent anything new. All they had to do was just use best practices, and all of these problems disappear. Okay. I'm now going to turn to my final topic, which is automotive security. And like airplanes, cars have gone through quite a bit of a technological change. So up until the late 1970s, cars were largely mechanical systems. However, fuel efficiency and environmental concerns led to the introduction of engine control computers. The idea being that these can regulate the amount of fuel that is going into the engine and thus use less fuel and be better for the environment. This was so wildly successful that we just started adding computers all over the place to the car. Modern cars contain dozens of discrete computers, and, well, that was one too far, but previously, all of these computers, all of the ones that needed to talk to each other, had point-to-point connections between them. But as the number of computers grew, that became not really feasible any longer, and so it switched to shared networks between all of these computers. The upshot is that any computer in the car can talk to any other computer in the car. And I'd like to draw your attention here to the radio being able to talk to, for example, the anti-lock brake system. Should that be the case? Probably not. Is it the case? Yep. Okay. Now, at the same time that these transformations were happening, we started adding external connectivity to our cars in the form of wireless tire pressure sensors or Bluetooth connections in the cabin or internet connections, digital radio signals, including the ability to play digital media files, and so forth. And I'm not sure if app stores ever came about, but that was a thing that seemed to be coming at the time. So, backing up here, I was in grad school at the time of these studies here. So a group at UC San Diego joined forces with a group at the University of Washington, and we decided we were going to buy a couple of cars. So we bought two identical make and model cars. Here's one. This is a UW car from about a year ago. And we decided to hack them. And so this time, since this is work from graduate school, when I say we decided to hack them, I mean that Carl and I and several other students spent a lot of time hanging out in cars trying to figure out how things worked. Okay, so most of your car is under computer control, and that means that it's potentially under attacker control. And so we can see this is everything from engines to brakes to the horn to lights, locks, heating, your instrument panel. Here's a picture of our instrument panel. If you can't read it, it's showing that the car is going 140 miles an hour in park. The car was, in fact, parked, and with a little bit of an unusual message appearing here, pwned by CarShark. CarShark was the tool we built to attack the car. So I'm going to show you a brief video here of disabling the car's brakes at speed. And so what we did was we arranged for wireless access to the car's internal network. There is a computer inside this car with Alexi here. Alexi is wearing protective gear, and he is on a decommissioned airport runway. It's a funny story. Feel free to ask me about that afterwards. And here we go.
3, 1, 0. Send the packet at 3, 2, 1, 0. I cannot brake. Let me try accelerating. Okay, now I'm at 20. I still can't brake. Let me try the efficacy. Let me try the efficacy of the parking brake in case someone actually might be in the situation.
All right. So as you can see, if we have access to the car's internal networks, we can control the brakes. There's a point a little bit later in the video where he asks if he can have his brakes back, because every time he... So, all right. Now, this was kind of known. The auto manufacturers knew that if you could access the car's internal networks, then surely you could do bad things with it. But there was this assumption that in order to access these internal networks, you actually needed to have physical access to the car. And the thinking goes, if you have physical access to the car, you could cut the brakes or something. I don't know. And so that was not, computers were not considered to be the real issue. Now, unfortunately, this was a faulty assumption because of this external connectivity that I described. We now have lots of ways that we can access the car. There are some indirect physical ways where there are computers that are attached to the car's internal networks that can themselves be attacked remotely. And then there are a variety of short-range and long-range wireless signals that can communicate with the car. For example, cellular telephones, in the case of telematic systems like OnStar. And OnStar is the system that we had in our car. So as part of this research, which took several years, what we did was we examined a number of different components in depth. And for every single one of these attack vectors here, we were able to completely compromise the car, which meant that we could control every aspect of it. So I'm just going to briefly mention my two favorite ones. The first is the radio. So I pointed out earlier that the radio is connected to the car's internal network, and there's a good reason for that. But the stock radio in this 2009 model year car had the ability to play digital media files like MP3s and Windows Media Audio. And one of the things that we discovered was that there was a bug in the code for playing Windows Media Audio files. And the result of this was that we constructed an audio file that if you were to play it on your computer would play just fine. In fact, it was one of the ones that comes with Windows, as I recall. And if you were to put it on a CD and stick it in the car's radio, that would be enough to compromise the radio, and then from there to compromise the entire rest of the car. The other one that I want to mention is the cellular telephone. So the radio one still involves some sort of user interaction, right? You have to give somebody this file, they have to do something with it, they have to take some action. Well, in cars that have telematics units like OnStar, they have cell phone numbers, and you can just call them. And when you call them, you can start communicating with the computers in the car. And the way it works is you just send a series of tones. It's very similar to dial-up internet, if you remember the screeching sounds that happened when you were connecting. Very similar. Sounds a little bit different, but same idea. And what you could do is, or what we demonstrated, is that we could create an MP3 that contained all of the attack information that we needed. And then here is a picture of Carl using the conference telephone at the University of Washington to call the car 1,500 miles away at UC San Diego and playing that MP3 into the phone and taking over the car in San Diego. So this is an attack that works globally. Okay, so I'm going to finish by talking about two scenarios in which one might want to do this. one can envision all sorts of scenarios like, I don't know, terrorism and so forth. I don't want to think about those. So that's not what my training is in. Let's talk about financially motivated crime, which is much closer, in particular, car theft. So the way that this works is step one, you compromise the car. So you call it, compromise the car. Now, the OnStar system, since it is helpful, since it does things like give you turn-by-turn directions, it has a GPS receiver, so it knows where it is. And I wrote some code that would tweet out the car's location every 30 seconds. So you could easily locate the car via GPS. You walk over to the car. We can unlock the locks, because the locks are under computer control. We can start the engine. So that's under computer control. And we can bypass the anti-theft measures and drive away. So car there. When he gets close, the some instructions are sent to the car to unlock the door. Realize next shot, it's a little hard to see, but there are no keys in the ignition when the camera zooms in here. So first, he puts on his seatbelt and can drive away, all without having ever had any all without having the keys. All right, the last scenario is surveillance, or maybe, I guess this could be used for stalking, which didn't occur to me until earlier today. The attack proceeds basically the same as before. You compromise the car, you have it continuously report its GPS coordinates, and since we have this OnStar system that supports hands-free calling and so forth, there's a microphone in the cabin, and so I wrote a program that would just stream all of the audio from the in-cabin mic to my computer. And so I accidentally, while testing this once, turned this system on and discovered that my colleagues at the University of Washington were driving somewhere in their car, and I could hear them talking. I freaked out and immediately disconnected from the computers. They were extra freaked out when I told them the next day. Okay, so my last good news here is, as President Ambar mentioned, the federal government took this very seriously. So the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, really did, they talked to us, they set up programs to try to address this. The auto manufacturers also took this very seriously. There were industry working groups that were created in order to address cybersecurity issues in cars. And we were informed that individual car companies received large increases in personnel and funding to work on the security of the computers in the car. And of course, the specific issues that we identified were fixed. So the bottom line here is that computers really make cars safer. Sometimes when I talk about this stuff, people will say, well, I'm going to get rid of all of the computers in my car. Terrible idea. Computers make you safer and make your car more fuel efficient. You want modern systems. All right. And so to recapitulate here, adversarial thinking can help people identify problems in systems before they get attacked. And this has two benefits. As a user, we can, in some cases, defend ourselves against attacks, such as by using unique passwords with password managers. And for the designers and engineers of systems, if they apply adversarial thinking about their products, then they can produce more secure products or provide mitigation measures against attacks for already deployed products. And with that, thank you so much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Hello. Hi, my name is Lawrence, and can you please tell us about the runway?
Yes, I would be delighted to tell you about the runway. So what happened is this was a runway, this was an airport in Washington State, and since my collaborators are at the University of Washington, which is technically a government agency, the computer science administrative assistant called up the airport operations and said, "Hi, we're the government of Washington. We need your airport." And they said, "Sure." So AAs are absolutely essential to doing anything at a college, as anyone who works here is well aware. Thank you for asking. I definitely wanted to tell that story.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on inter-car or inter-vehicle communication. I'm really surprised and disappointed that we don't have any mechanisms currently designed for car drivers to talk with each other, cars and truck drivers to talk with each other. It's just totally missing. Given all the concerns you illuminated today, what would you be thinking about that to design for?
Yeah, so that's a great question. For years now, there have been proposals for vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. And I have reviewed a number of these, and to be honest, they have all been very lacking in security. So you're talking about communication between two vehicles, and I think that the possibilities for abuse there are pretty clear. You could imagine driving down the road and all of a sudden somebody starts yelling at you in your car. That would be very bad. But there are also proposals for things like vehicles can report their own position in much the same way that aircraft report their own position. And I think that we have many of the same problems with how do you trust some external system that's saying, hey, let me give a concrete scenario. The car in front of you, the person brakes. And so the car relays a signal to everyone around, hey, I just braked real hard. And so you'd better start braking right now too. So that seems great, but what happens when someone builds a box that just sends out that signal? And now you're driving down the highway and all of a sudden your car comes screeching to a stop, thinking it's about to hit something in front of it. And I have not seen to date anything that can really handle that. But yeah, only human to human and not computer to computer. Well, at least in the trucker case, we've got that with like CB radio and so forth. But this is certainly something that people could consider. I'm not sure how it would work out.
Sorry, hello.
Hi.
So I was thinking about two things. The first one was password managers, which is, okay, great, we have all these complex passwords, but we're storing them all in one place, and we're hiding them all behind one password that you can remember.
That's right.
So it feels like we've just created a new, arguably larger vulnerability. If you guess one password, you get all of them.
You're absolutely right, and that is a critical point. You need to have a very secure password for your password manager, and I strongly recommend that you would also pair that with something like a security key. Oh, I guess I shouldn't let you see my keys, but here I've got actually several of them on my keychain, and I recommend that you use them with every website that lets you use the security keys. And it's a huge hassle, as Cynthia can attest, as I'm frequently saying, now I have to go to the other part of the house to get my keys to log into my computer. But it really prevents a bunch of the problems. But you're absolutely right, and password managers like LastPass have been in the news recently for having a breach last year that they did not disclose. So it's definitely, there's definitely a risk.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm William. I'm thinking about, as I'm looking at you talking about using like adversarial strategies, you're thinking about using a system in a way it wasn't intended, that say you're accessing somebody's system in their plane and you misinterpreted the system they're using, you send a signal that their system wasn't intended to manage and you break it. I don't know. I know the point of your talk is not, hey, let's try all these things and apply them. Your point is, let's prevent them. I don't know. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
So are you asking me, well, I guess there are two things.
So for instance, sometimes when you run an Nmap scan, you can mess up the system that you're mapping. That's kind of the things that I'm talking about.
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely right. That's a great point. A friend of mine, in fact, shut down an oil pipeline by accidentally scanning the entire internet. And it turned out that the systems were really not expecting to receive that scan, and they got shut down. In that case, that's on them, in my view. But if your computers are on the internet, you have to expect that they're going to get internet traffic, right? But what you're saying here about attacking systems is you do have to be very careful about the ones that you're trying to study to see how things work. So when I talk to my students, when I teach them to think adversarially, I tell them that they should think adversarially about every single system that they interact with. It's just a fun intellectual exercise, and it can really help train them in thinking adversarially, which does not come naturally to most people. But there are some caveats here. With things you own, you can absolutely try to subvert them and make them do bad things. With things you don't own, do not. And so, it comes down to, really, we've got the, too far. We've got real adversaries that exist in the world today, and they are absolutely doing this right now. They are attacking systems because they want to make money. And so we, as computer scientists, have to do this as well so that we can figure out how to defend against it.
I was wondering about how you compromise the link between the receivers and the tablet, or what even was that link? And
yeah, that's a great question. So there was a part to this which I did not mention, which is that for that we actually need to have access to the aircraft. And what we did was we just put a small computer, like a Raspberry Pi style computer, in the aircraft that was able to communicate wirelessly with the tablet. So for one of them, the receiver would say, here is my position, I'm at these coordinates, and then we would immediately follow up with a message saying, no, we're at these other coordinates. And the software was not written well enough to distinguish these two messages, and so it just went with whatever the latest one was. Which incidentally is exactly how the speedometer showing 140 miles an hour in park is. We just, every second or something, we send a packet saying, we're going 140 miles an hour, and another packet gets sent saying, we're going 0 miles an hour. No, we're going 140 miles an hour. And it just goes with whatever it sees last.
Is the auto industry doing anything, excuse me, to cure I think of as sort of a low-tech security problem, which is if your car opens with a key fob, there are thieves who can run around, and if they're within, I've forgotten whether it's 50 yards or how many yards of your key fob, and your key fob is not protected, which we have done, and we didn't do it in the freezer, then they can pick up the signal and send a signal to your key fob that then opens your car. And it seems like that's a fairly simple, which should be a simple thing to fix, but are they doing anything about that one?
Yeah, so I'm aware of one particular mitigation measure against the attacks you describe. And the way it works is when you have your key fob and you push the button on it, it sends a signal to the car, and I forget the exact details of how this worked, but there was something about the time it takes the signal to reach there, and a response that comes back from the car. Essentially, it's looking to see, is the key fob close enough to the car to actually allow this to work? And people developed attacks exactly as you described, where you could just sort of be near the person and the attack would still succeed. So there are examples of people who can walk up to cars. They do something. I've seen video of this where they were walking up to the passenger side. I don't know why the passenger side, but always the passenger side. And then the door just unlocks and they get in. So these attacks do exist. My understanding is that the auto manufacturers care very deeply about theft in particular. So I assume that that is something that is top of mind. But I'm not aware of what the current state of the art in that sort of defense is.
Steve, my name is Marcel. Mine is not a question. I want to thank you very much for this lecture today. I'm the new Chief Information Officer, and and my expertise is in cybersecurity. So thank you very much, and I thank the president and the team who organized this. Thank you.
Thank you. It's I look forward to speaking with you more at some point.
Well, if there's a student, I don't want to be last, but first of all, thank you for your talk. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
I was heartened to hear the seriousness with which the auto industry is taking this problem. As we think about now, internet connected everything, toasters, refrigerators, toilets, God knows what. Has that same level of seriousness, have these lessons learned been applied to everything else new, or is it just the Wild West and the autos are an outlier because of financial things and everything else, whereas the rest of our homes are just one big, great Stasi fantasy land, and we're doomed?
Well, I want to push back on the we're doomed part, but the devices that you're talking about tend to be called Internet of Things devices, and the security of Internet of Things devices and all the smart home stuff has been abysmal, just absolutely abysmal. For some reason, the lessons learned in one area do not seem to be picked up in other areas. This is why I said that when the problems with the airplane, the MCIS computers, the problems we found with them could just be fixed by standard techniques. Nothing new needed to happen at all, and yet they didn't use those standard techniques, and I don't know why. Thank you very much.